The Voice of ESG.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Voice of ESG. With today a somewhat different topic we are going to discuss, because the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, exists 5 years. Time for a party, right?
Woo! Yay!
And therefore I have invited two wonderful women in front of me who are absolutely experts on this topic. And we are going to delve a little bit deeper into this topic. But first, a small introduction, and let me start with our guest, Kimberly Friesen. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I'm Kimberly Friesen. I'm a privacy lawyer at the Data Lawyers. We are a boutique law firm based in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. And we help clients with, for example, privacy compliance with the GDPR, multinationals in all kinds of sectors, but also medium-sized firms all over the world.
Thank you, and very welcome here.
Thank you.
We go to my colleague, Nicky. Nicky?
Thank you. Nicky Goes, working for over 6 years with RSM now. As a consultant, have a strong focus on financial supervision laws and anti-money laundering compliance, but also GDPR, the interesting topic that we are discussing here today.
And me, myself, Adiyaman, manager emerging technologies. I specialize in all kind of law and technology related topics in which we help international clients with their questions. And today is GDPR party day, like mentioned. I can remember when I was studying at the university, we didn't have a GDPR yet. I think it was called Directive 9846 by heart. And out of sudden, this GDPR monster came, and I can remember working at a lawyer's office together with Kimberly back in the days. 25th of May 2018 was doomsday. Everyone has to be prepared, and if you were not compliant, you would get these big fines of 4% worldwide turnover, etc. I can remember those days very well. Now, 5 years later, we are going to discuss if it's actually true what happened. Did all these ideas, did all these weird suggestions, did they come true? So, one way or the other, we saw that the GDPR had a significant impact on organizations. Data subjects came into existence out of sudden. Data subject rights, international transfer of data. And after 5 years, we can say quite a lot has happened. So let me start with a question to Nicky. What have been some of the most notable regulatory developments or updates to the GDPR over the past 5 years? Could you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, of course, I think a lot has happened over the last 5 years when it comes to GDPR. But one of the most outstanding ones is, I think, the Schrems II ruling, which had a lot of impact, especially on international active organizations. Because to give a short recap, in July 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled that the US privacy shield was no longer applicable. Meaning that international data transfers to the US are no longer under GDPR, not longer compliant with GDPR. So for companies who would like to transfer personal data to the US from the EU, they have to undertake additional steps to do it compliant with GDPR, which means that companies should, for example, implement SECs or perform data transfer impact assessments. So you can imagine that has a lot of impact on organizations which were transferring personal data to the US on a large scale, which also impacts, of course, doing business with the US.
You mentioned SES. I know what it is, but standard contractual clauses.
The SECs, yes.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
That for specific data transfers, specific agreements has to be made where agreements are made on how the data is being protected, especially with the company within the US. So the additional safeguards that the company takes to make sure that the way the data is being processed in the US is being compliant with the European data privacy rules, the GDPR.
And I think maybe to add, the good news is, I think, that of course now companies cannot rely on the privacy shield because it's no longer valid. But I think the good news for this year is that the European Commission is working on a new, kind of adequacy decision. And I believe the European Commission is hopeful that this will be finalized this summer. However, it's already May, so, let's see. And it also means if it enters into force this year, the United States still need to implement all the promises they made. So it's unclear yet when companies can actually rely on it again as a transfer mechanism, but it's in the making. So that's good news, I think.
Okay, thank you. And from your practice, from your own law practice, what are the most used ways of transferring data outside the EU you have noticed?
Yeah, so if you are lucky, there's an adequacy decision published by the European Commission. If not, most companies use the standard contractual clauses. And the bigger companies do have BCR, so the binding corporate rules that are approved by a supervisory authority. But most companies rely on the standard contractual clauses. And if there's not an adequacy decision, you also need, as Nicky already mentioned, to perform a transfer impact assessment.
Are all these companies actually using these mechanisms, or are most of them still just transferring data outside the EU without actually having some safeguards in place?
I think in this context, it's interesting to mention everything that has happened in the context of Google Analytics, because this made a lot of companies focus on these transfers and worrying about these transfers and wanting to be compliant because all these supervisory authorities were focusing on Google Analytics. And this actually happened right after the European Court of Justice case has published in 2020. The organization None of Your Business, NOIB, filed 101 complaints all over Europe with respect to international transfers and specifically in the context of Google Analytics. And this every supervisory authority actually has to respond to a complaint. So they had to say something about whether the use of Google Analytics and the international transfers in that context are compliant. And what we saw is that some supervisory authorities provided some clear guidance, some strict guidance, but clear guidance, saying that it's prohibited to use it. And other supervisory authorities, for example, the Dutch Data Protection Authority, were more vague, didn't really provide a lot of guidance. So I think, to come back to your question, when this all started, organizations were really motivated to be compliant. However, it's not always clear for organizations how they should be compliant, especially when the supervisory authorities are not providing clear guidance.
That's actually the same what I see with our clients. We serve a lot of Chinese clients, a lot of US clients, but still they don't directly think about these kind of safeguards which have to be taken in advance before you actually transfer personal data, but more important, sensitive personal data, which is also just sent around to the US, but also mainly to China. So what I see is there's an uprise in sudden GDPR questions because we see more and more Asian companies slowly coming towards Europe mainland. So the GDPR is quite a new topic for them and a good way to help them with having transfer data in a compliant manner. So that is what I have noticed in my own practice. And I'm happy to help them, of course. I want to continue actually with another question, more or less the same question, what we have discussed before. I'm quite curious about what we see with the authorities, with the data protection authorities, right? So we are now 5 years into implementation. We have seen quite some significant fines. I want to zoom in a little bit more into that. Let's say, Kimberly, last 5 years.
Yeah. So I think what you already mentioned when we were working together when the GDPR was introduced, all companies were in a hurry. We have to be compliant before May 2018. We had a lot of work to do. And then companies started realizing, okay, this is not just one time project we had. This is an ongoing process to be GDPR compliant. And one of the reasons why organizations started to worry about the implementation of the GDPR was, of course, because of the enforcement and because of the high fines. And what we see in that regard is that a lot of big companies that you would expect have received fines, the big tech Silicon Valley companies. However, what I think is extremely important is that not only those big companies are being fined, but also the smaller companies, but also the government, political organizations. And in the Netherlands, we even saw a small dentist practice that received a fine for not securing their website accurately. And at first I was thinking, why do you focus on a small dentist practice? But of course, it's important for all organizations to realize that they need to comply with the GDPR and that it's important, and that enforcement actions can also take place with respect to the smaller or the less prominent big Silicon Valley companies.
That's funny that you say that, because in preparation for this podcast, we also made a dashboard with all the fines and enforcement actions taken by authorities. And while scrolling through the data, I saw a company was selling kebab who got fined because they were non-compliant with GDPR.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's not exactly what you said. It's not only the Silicon Valley companies, not only the big hotels and tech companies, but also the kebab store in the corner of the street. Which data protection authority you think is the teacher in front of the class? I have an idea, but I'm not sure.
Well, we have, of course, the ICO, but the
Which
UK
is from?
left.
Exactly.
They are the supervisory authority in the UK, but of course they left the EU. I think they still provide interesting guidance, but it's maybe a little bit less relevant now. Then we have the French authorities, the CNIL. I think that's a very important one. And I think the German supervisory authorities, they have many of them, but their guidance is very detailed. And I think that helps or could help organizations.
Interesting, yeah. The CNIL or the CNIL, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, is very active also with the latest technological developments. Yesterday I read they were also published quite a long roadmap regarding AI and generative AI, and in what way that will impact privacy and data protection. So they're quite on the ball, and they're quite
On top of it.
Busy with these kind of topics. What I was also thinking was Ireland, right? I think Schrems was...
Because of the location of the big firms in Ireland.
Exactly, because I think I'm not sure if I can mention companies, but let's say Amazon and Facebook. I think the fines were given by the Irish Data Protection Authority.
Yeah, but I think that's because they need to, and not because they are providing the most clearest guidance besides the enforcement.
Fines. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I always thought it was Ireland which was the bad teacher in front of the class, and the tech companies were the pupils who didn't do their homework. Okay, let's continue. Nicky, of course you are an AML expert.
Yes.
And perhaps one thinks AML, privacy. So I'm curious, have there been any legal challenges or maybe court cases related to the GDPR?
Yeah, definitely. For example, under the AML regulations, there has been a new requirement when it comes to registering the UBOs of companies within a central register, which is accessible to the public, actually. And there has been a case here in the Netherlands, but also on European level, the Sovim case in Luxembourg. And the court there has ruled just because the register was available towards the public, and a lot of personal data when it comes to names of the UBOs of certain companies have been registered therein. A lot of people can see who is behind a company and what is their name.
But hold on, what is a UBO?
Ultimate beneficent owner of a company.
Aha, clear.
And it's required for financial institutions to obtain this information under the AMLD requirements. And because it's a violation of the personal data being accessible towards the public, the European Court of Justice has ruled that it's not a violation that can be justified because of the legal obligations of those financial institutions. So that has quite some impact because it means it will be more difficult for financial institutions to obtain certain information on the clients that they are performing the client investigation on, because they cannot easily access the UBO information. So that also shows that the GDPR has impact on a broader scale. So it also impacts financial institutions. And here in the Netherlands, the reaction of the minister was to immediately terminate the access to the public of the UBO register. But what we see in practice is that it already impacts the financial institutions because, questions arise. Okay, how can I verify that indeed this person is the UBO of the company that I'm performing the client investigation on?
And these financial institutions, what ways are they now trying to get this data from, or are they just doing it in a non-compliant manner, the same way as they did before?
Well, of course, you're in direct contact with your client. So the first step in every way is to ask your client for the information. You can always verify it by shareholders' registers, but it's also incorporated in the law to verify the information that you obtain from your client of who is their UBO with the information that's accessible within the public registers. So that as a fact is not possible anymore for now. There have been some publications that the register will be made available again, but at least for the financial institutions who has to obtain this information because of their legal obligations under the anti-money laundering compliance regulations. But you can see it's a thin line.
Okay, interesting. I never thought about it that way, but you can see the spillover effects of a regulation who started as a standalone data protection regulation, which is now also slowly spilling over to other sectors and other branches, let's put it that way.
You can also see the link between GDPR with another aspect, that's the joint transaction monitoring legislative bills, which have been published a couple of years ago, because it means that banks within the Netherlands, but also within the European Union, will be able to exchange information on their clients about the transactions of their clients more easily. So they have a centralized way of transaction monitoring, which is also one of the requirements under the anti-money laundering regulations. But that means that these banks will get more information, also transfer more information to other banks. And one of the other aspects of this legislative bill is that they have to give each transaction that they are monitoring a unique number. So within the bill, it has been proposed to link that to the personal identification number, which is quite sensitive data. And that means that banks are actually obtaining more personal data from their clients, but also not only for certain transactions, but actually a lot more transactions as the requirements currently are.
Which I have my question marks with, because within the GDPR we know you are not allowed to process more data than necessary. You have to have a legal base in order to process this data. You need to have some kind of purpose why you are processing this data. So I'm very curious on what legal basis these banks are possibly processing this much data more than necessary, if I hear you correctly, right?
Yeah. Well, that was exactly one of the points of the Dutch Data Protection Authority in their response to this legislative bill. At least within the legislative bill, it is mentioned that there are certain additional requirements when it comes to obtaining this extra personal data, but also they should only use this data, of course, for the specific purpose, and that's only matching a transaction with a specific person. And that also means that they have to undertake additional safeguards within the legislative bill. It was also discussed that, for example, the data should be pseudonymized and encrypted, and make sure that only the persons who actually need to have access to this data can have access and no more.
That's Kimberly. Now, 5 years later, what do you think was the most impressive court case you saw regarding the GDPR?
Well, what I think is an interesting court case, or the court cases, I think of course, data subjects are allowed to claim damages based on the GDPR, and there have been several court cases where the court decided that the data subject was had the right to receive those damages. They were not that high. The compensation they would be getting, it was about €100 to 250 euros or 500 euros. And the question is and was whether if an infringement of the GDPR has taken place, whether a data subject always has a right to claim damages. And it's interesting that actually this month, the 4th of May, the European Court of Justice decided that it's not always if the GDPR has been infringed that the data subject has a right for financial compensation. It also set out that, or stipulated that local member states can decide how it's decided when a data subject has a right for financial damages. But it's not always the case if an infringement takes place. A data subject has a right for financial compensation. And I think this is good news for the organizations.
Yeah, it's some kind of carte blanche for the companies. They can go a little cross the line, living on the edge, let's put it that way, process a little bit more than the law states. And in the end, they will still have, at least they have the chance not being fined for it. That's how I read it.
Well, I think it depends on how a member state or the court will be deciding when a data subject has a right for financial compensation. And that's not clear yet. So I think it depends how this will be implemented.
After 5 years, I have to say, it has become some kind of normal. All these court cases, all these infringements, all these enforcement activities. I couldn't pick one, I should say. What I find intriguing and interesting is the GDPR actually came out of the blue, let's put it that way. And it is a regulation which now almost every company knows what it is and what it does. And I didn't expect that back in the days. It started with lots of D-Day, 25th of May kind of marketing from many consultancy offices and law offices. And I thought that will fly away within a few months. But I still notice, even in our office, if we don't lock our laptop, you get a fine. From
you have to bake a pie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it made people aware. And even in the smallest areas like our office, we have to give the pot €5 every time someone leaves a laptop open.
And what do you do with the €5?
Well, we're going to spend it, I think, within 2 weeks on a
very nice lunch altogether.
Yeah,
nice.
So these small actions make people aware, and I think that is the most important case for the GDPR. And I think it has accomplished its mission.
Yeah, because of the enforcement, you mean that there have been actually high fines. But I also think that what I already mentioned a few minutes ago is that first I think companies were thinking, okay, this is a one-time project. We will introduce all the privacy statements, the standard documentation, but that it's actually an ongoing process. I mean, every business thinks of new services and products they want to introduce, and always it's necessary to check whether it's privacy compliant. But I also think so it's ongoing, so it will always, organizations will always be busy with privacy compliance. It's not a one-time thing. But I also think that customers became more aware, especially also in the COVID period, where on the one hand people were afraid of losing their jobs or their business or becoming ill. But on the other hand, processing personal data was a solution to this, or could be a solution to this, with the Corona Passport or the Corona app. So people started to see, okay, there is a very good purpose to process my personal data, and I'm afraid of COVID, but I'm also afraid to lose my privacy. And I think that created a lot of privacy awareness for people, and that also makes that organizations want to be privacy proof, because their clients and their customers want them to be privacy proof.
Yeah, and it does not stop, I think, with creating policies and procedures. As you already mentioned, the challenge that we have within the office when it comes to locking screens, it starts with the behavior of your own employees and embedding that within the company and make sure that everybody is aware why do we want to be compliant, but also see the importance and start with that proper training, but also the awareness of your own employees. What can happen if you do not lock your screen when it's not in the office, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree. I have nothing to add, to be honest. I slowly want to move towards the end. I have 2 questions. I think Nicky also has a question.
Yes, turning back to you as you are our technology expert. In addition to the GDPR, how do you think that companies are dealing with the challenges of complying with various law and technology topics across different countries?
That's an interesting question. I should have known that question. Well, what we are seeing is this flood of this wave of new legislation from Brussels, directives, regulations. They just keep coming, and I think GDPR was a seed who made this possible. What we see now is many new laws coming up regarding to platforms, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, many new laws relating to data. I think Kimberly can also tell more about that. We have seen the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the Non-Personal Data Directive or Act, I'm not sure. But we are seeing more and more technology-related legislation coming up. Of course, that's how people know Brussels. It's a machine which produces laws, many laws. But also with the latest technological advancements, new emerging technologies with, for instance, crypto. Last week, the MiCA regulation got finalized and got published. We are heading towards an AI Act, but also an AI liability directive. So they just keep on going and going. So I can think about, like, imagine me, I'm doing this daily, but I can't keep up. And I can understand that companies, international companies, have the same problems because it's so much. I'm not sure, Kimberly, do you also see this in your own practice?
Yeah, I think the first question is what is being introduced and what does this mean for my organization? Is it applicable to my organization? And I think it's not only, you mentioned Brussels as a machine, but I think there are actually a lot of machines active all around the world, and that's what I mean, that a lot of new data protection laws and other kinds of laws are introduced all over the world. So it's not only within the EU that you need to comply with a lot of rules with respect to the processing of personal data or using data or new technologies. It's actually all around the world. And I think a lot of companies are active in the online environment or also focus on countries outside of the EU. So they also need to be aware of the data protection laws being introduced in Brazil, in China, in Indonesia, in Australia, it's in Canada, in Turkey. It's actually everywhere. And the funny thing is that those new data protection laws are actually very similar to the GDPR. And first organizations thought, oh, that's easy. We already have implemented the GDPR, so we will be fine. But actually it makes it very complicated because it's slightly different. We have the same definitions in a lot of rules, but they are slightly different. And for example, the cookie banners is a good example. It's hard to find 100% compliant cookie banner that is compliant with respect to all the guidance published in the EU. But if you realize that also the Brazilian Supervisory Authority and the Canadian Supervisory Authority and the Turkish Supervisory Authorities have published guidelines with respect to the cookie banners, how are organizations able to keep track of all these guidelines and be able to implement all these requirements? So I think this is a very big challenge for any organization that is active worldwide.
I am seeing the exact same thing with cyber legislation. When I look at the NIS2 directive, which is published recently, to the DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, but also the new Cyber Resilience Act. Like you said, every country, every continent has its own rules regarding the governance of these technological developments or topics which are becoming more and more important. So I understand the struggle of the companies, because it is quite hard to mimic in all country the same rules and same procedures for every company. But I think that's how the world works.
Yeah, I don't know.
To be honest,
I think it's a risk, because I think
why
it's
do you think it's a risk?
Yeah, because I think it's important to think about cybersecurity, to have rules regarding cybersecurity, and to have rules on how companies should be processing personal data. But I think a risk of so many rules is overcomplicating it, so that companies are only worrying about, okay, what are the rules, first of all, and then how are we able to be compliant everywhere at the same time? And I think it's important. I'm not saying that companies should not be doing this. However, I think companies lose focus, and they should be focusing on where are the highest privacy risks in my organization, and how am I ensuring that we are securely processing data and personal data, instead of only focusing on these very detailed rules that are so complicated and sometimes so vague. I think that's sometimes a waste of money and time.
I totally agree.
Practical guidance is needed there.
Exactly.
Especially for the large international active organizations with exposure in a lot of countries.
Overcompliance is a thing we don't want within our company. I think also within your lawyer's office. But we see it exactly. We see a lot of questions about these compliance-related or risk-related topics. But that's not the way around. I think think logically. Try to pinpoint or assess at least whether what you said, the highest risks are when you process data. What governance-related implementation or mitigation risks did I take in advance when a cyber incident occurs? Because sooner or later there will be some kind of cyber incident within your company. So think logically, I would say, to every company, and prioritize the most important topics first. I have one more question to both of you. What steps can organizations take to ensure ongoing compliance with the GDPR and other data protection regulations? Let's start with Kimberly.
In my opinion, training and awareness is the most important thing. I think a lot of organizations now have a dedicated person, a DPO, a data protection officer, or a privacy officer, or another dedicated person, or even a dedicated team that is aware of privacy and knows the rules and knows how to comply with it. But of course, those people and these teams cannot do it by themselves. They need people in the organizations that actually realize when a risk may occur, when a product should be adjusted to be more privacy compliant. So I think creating more awareness and training, I think it takes a lot of time for these people and these teams to provide these trainings, awareness to everyone in a company. But I think in the end, it saves them a lot of time, because you can have a beautiful data protection, data breach procedure. But if people don't know where to find it, or that what a data breach is, or even what is personal data, then they will not notify you when something has happened. And if business and development is creating new products and services, and at the end they ask the privacy team, please, can you check this? We want to go live next week. And they get a no, and they get frustrated, and they think, oh, the privacy officer never wants to approve our products. I think if they are more privacy aware, they will start developing products and services that are more privacy friendly. So more privacy by design. So I think training and awareness is one of the most important topics.
So appropriate technical and organizational measures as mentioned in the GDPR. Okay, clear. And Nicky?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think it indeed starts with training and awareness. And of course, you should have well-designed policies and procedures to map out what is required and how should you handle in certain situations and incorporate that within the governance of your organization. But it all starts with your employees, because you can have beautiful design policies, but if nobody knows where to find them and nobody knows what's actually the content and how should they handle, what's the use of your policy then? Then it's just a written tiger, so to speak.
What I find obvious is that companies have to look in their own database and see what kind of data they all have. Because sometimes you walk into a company and you look into their database and there is data of years and years of age who have to be deleted for years ago, but is still swinging around.
Yeah.
So I think that is also a very easy and important step to take. Just have a look in your database, see what data and documents you have, and delete them if you don't need them. That would be my advice actually to all companies.
Yeah, I agree. And making people aware can already start with baking a pie and bringing it to the office if you do not look your screen. So.
These are nice words to close this conversation. I want to thank Kimberly for coming here.
Thank you.
And Nicky, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And for the listeners, thank you for listening and hope to see you back soon.